Hey, before we begin, I want to once again remind people about the merch store at demuted-shop-fourthwall.com. We have plenty of apparel, accessories, and other products with designs made by yours truly. Definitely be sure to check this shop out if you want to show your support. Thank you and enjoy the video. If there's one character that I'm probably best known for having somewhat of an obsession with, it's almost definitely the Mimic from the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. In fact, I'm proud to say that I was among the first Mimic tubers, to a point where even my buddies like The Baddest or Dags or Postra referred to me as a Mimic tuber because of how much I talked about the guy. But with this title comes a very heavy burden. If I want to be a Mimic tuber, I need to prove my salt. I need to be able to prove that I know what I'm talking about. And that's why I'm gonna rip the band-aid right off. The Mimic, as we see him in the books and in Security Breach Ruin, does not make sense. And I'm gonna explain why. But why does he not make sense? What could I even mean by this? I mean, it seems pretty straightforward. He's a robot who mimics things that he sees, most likely powered by the human emotion of agony, and he likes to kill things. A lot. So, what doesn't make sense about the Mimic? Well, when it was made, where it was before the Pizzaplex, how it got to the Pizzaplex, why it's there now, how we see it moving around in Ruin, and even how it looks in-game. There's a lot here that needs explaining, a lot that needs theorizing, and a lot that I simply don't have the answers to. So without further ado, let's get started with the beginning of the Mimic timeline. By the way, I know the irony in me making a video criticizing the very idea of making a FNaF timeline, and then me turning around and making what is essentially a FNaF timeline. But I want to tackle that head on. I think in this scenario, tracking one character is a much more reasonable task, especially a character like the Mimic who has so much of their origin written out and easily digested. This timeline isn't about solving the Bite of 87 or tallying up all of Afton's victims, it's about tracking one character in their decades-long journey from point A to point B. Granted, this is still FNaF, so it's going to be complicated. Maybe you should totally share this video with your friends so they get their own ideas. Anyway, enough stalling, let's go. The Mimic's origin as it's given was that sometime early on in the creation of Fazbear Entertainment, the company had hired a man named Edwin Murray. Edwin was an inventor who had designed an AI-controlled vacuum cleaner. Although it's probably meant to be similar to a Roomba, a lot of people have said that Edwin may have created Mr. Hugs, and I find that option to be incredibly funny, so we're gonna roll with that. The problem is that Edwin was a single father to a very young child named David, and due to his salary not being all that great, Edwin and David had lived in the factory where Edwin worked. Edwin's job was essentially creating animatronics. However, Edwin was not a very great dad, and instead of actually tending to his young son's needs, decided to instead create his own help. And so, Edwin designed the top half of an endoskeleton and created a program which would run inside of it that allowed it to observe and mimic. This endoskeleton was, of course, the Mimic. However, this is where things went wrong. Although the Mimic played with David and kept him entertained by mimicking him, it wasn't really a stand-in for a parent or guardian. Eventually, David would roll his ball into nearby traffic, and when trying to get it back, would be struck and killed by a car. This death affected Edwin greatly, sending him spiraling into grief. But it was made worse by the fact that the Mimic didn't seem to recognize that David was dead. Instead, it kept mimicking him, even holding a white tiger toy Edwin had made for it to mimic the way David held his own, with his arm curled up to his chest. Seeing the Mimic act like this enraged Edwin, who then savagely beat the robot with a metal pipe. This ended up damaging the Mimic's head, but furthermore, it also infected the Mimic with his agony. The way agony works in the FNaF universe is that as an emotion, it lingers longer than any other emotion. So if something bad happens and creates a ton of human agony, that agony has a chance to seep into objects related to that tragedy and animate them. In this instance, Edwin infected the Mimic with his own agony in this moment. But worse than that, in my opinion, is that Edwin inadvertently taught the Mimic violence during the beating. Eventually, Edwin would abandon the Mimic in the factory and move on with his life, while still working for FazN. However, that was not the end of the Mimic's story. A few months later, Fazbear Entertainment sent out multiple teams to retrieve the Mimic from the factory. The first team had given the Mimic a pair of legs, but none of them returned. A second team, the team we follow through the rest of the Mimic's story, are killed one by one as the Mimic lies in wait for them in mascot costumes, killing them by mimicking Edwin's daily routine. One is hung up by a coat hanger, another stuffed into the fridge. You get the idea. Eventually, Fazbear Entertainment does get its hands on the Mimic, but it's unclear how since the Mimic does kill every member of the second team. But there you have it, the beginning of the Mimic timeline. This piece is definitely the easiest to lay out since it mostly just relies on the Mimic's short story. It tells us what he is, what he does, and what he's capable of. And this would remain consistent throughout the rest of the stories. well, sort of consistent. This is probably going to be the shortest segment of the timeline, primarily because we don't actually know all that much about what the Mimic was doing before the Pizzaplex is built. And given that when Edwin makes the Mimic he's a young adult, and when we see Edwin in the Pizzaplex he's an old man, there's a pretty big gap in time that we just don't know enough about. However, we do have some very small clues hidden here or there. The first, and one that I've harped on before, is that at one point in the Tales from the Pizzaplex epilogues, it's mentioned that Fazbear Entertainment had created several Mimic Endos as part of their own line. However, these were discontinued after they started acting too human-like. In my opinion, this line may actually be the Glamrock Endos we see in Security Breach, recycled from this old point in the timeline, but this is yet to be proven. As it stands, it's unclear if the Mimic seen in the actual Mimic story is even meant to be the same Mimic as the one in the epilogues, but for simplicity's sake, we're going to believe that they are. Also, if there really are multiple Mimics active in this story, the fact that we've only ever seen one in a room at any given time tells us we are probably just dealing with the one threat. However, the question then becomes, what did these other Mimics see and why does that matter? Well, the reason given that they were deactivated was that they acted human in ways that weren't expected. Ways that weren't expected can help us narrow it down to behavior that would be deemed inappropriate at a Freddy's location. Playing arcade games or celebrating with kids? Probably expected. But say, luring kids into a back room in a yellow bunny suit? I'm gonna guess expected, but still bad. That last part is heavy speculation, by the way, but it's a fair guess given that whatever these Mimics saw and recreated was apparently harmful enough to totally do away with the entire line. The next detail is that the Mimic is introduced in Tales from the Pizzaplex #1 with a very unique look. Notably, he has a shiny head but a totally burnt-looking body, as if he had been through a fire of some kind, and also at some point had his head replaced. And this is important because there have been a couple of very relevant fires to take place during the FNaF story. The most notable ones to me are the FNaF 3 fire and the FNaF 6 fire. Between these two, most seem to lean towards the Mimic being involved in the Pizza Place fire, which I can definitely see. When the Mimic arrives at the Pizzaplex, he's shipped to the construction crew working down in the Pizza Place's ruins, possibly because he was being returned there after being taken away. If my Tiger Rock theory is true and Fazbear Entertainment took the Mimic's original head to make Help Wanted, then it being returned with this brand new one could just be Fazbear Entertainment trying to cover up what they did. The other possibility is that it was in the FNaF 3 fire, but I'm far more skeptical of this option considering that Phone Dude gets very excited about Springtrap being a real one. If he already had the Mimic, then he would have had a real one already. In truth, the Mimic being in the Pizza Place fire makes the most sense to me. After all, Henry did want to end the story there, so it makes sense that if he knew about the Mimic, he would bring the Mimic there as well. Wow, I said that would be the shortest section, but man, this is getting long. Anyway, Pizzaplex time. Now that the Mimic has been moved into the Pizzaplex, we once again have a straightforward timeline to follow. The Mimic, with this burnt body and new head, is programmed by the construction crew to tear the limbs and heads off the different endoskeletons and animatronics in the Pizza Place, and pile them up into a tangle. Eventually, though, the Mimic runs out of endoskeletons and settles for basically anything vaguely humanoid in shape, killing off the entire construction crew, save for one worker. That worker then sealed the place in with concrete, but it wasn't really foolproof. A group of teens find themselves trapped in the underground ruins now, and one by one they're killed by the Mimic, who is described with some really unique abilities. First off, its body is capable of changing form to fit into any mascot costume. It hides in various fitted suits with ease, sneaking up on the teens and picking them off. It's even capable of assuming a spider-like form complete with a proboscis made from one of its own legs. The Mimic is known to have an EMP effect on technology as well, causing lights to flicker when it's near and other failures. It's at this point I'm going to say a spoiler warning for the last Tales from the Pizzaplex book, B72, since this book is technically not supposed to be out yet but has been found at retail stores. Anyway, in this book we finally get an ending to the teen's story, as Lucia is the sole survivor. She manages to trick the Mimic into climbing into a lemon and lime jester outfit, a springlock suit that it had worn before in the past. When the Mimic gets springlocked, Lucia is able to deactivate it and is rescued by a construction worker. The Mimic is left down in the Pizza Place, springlocked and deactivated. However, this epilogue also mentions its ability to self-repair. And as far as we know, that's the last we hear of the Mimic before the events of Security Breach. So now let's go to post-Security Breach. In this epilogue to Security Breach, Cassie finds the Mimic trapped in the Pizza Place. As it turns out, the Mimic had been communicating with her the entire time in Gregory's voice, as vocal mimicking is a talent it had established in the Tales books. The books even mentions that it does this over a radio, just like in Ruin. The Mimic, now freed by Cassie, attempts to chase and kill her, but is unable to get onto the elevator that Cassie escapes on. It's then likely that the Mimic takes over the speaker system in the elevator and causes it to drop, but that's more so speculation than anything else. In another ending, the Mimic has assembled a hybrid costume of sorts from various other mascot costumes. In this ending, Cassie runs through a set of previously locked doors and finds herself in a scooping room, where the Mimic is, well, scooped. It's left unclear if the Mimic escapes or dies in this ending, as the costume itself is empty when the fog finally clears. And that is just about it. But you've probably noticed a big gap in logic, time, space, and just about everything involving the book Mimic and the Ruin Mimic. Although these two are definitely one and the same, there's a lot that goes completely unexplained. For starters, the design differences. I can totally believe that the Mimic in Ruin is meant to look burnt, but in no way does this head look any different from the rest of its body. Also, the book Mimic is said to have long antennae on the top of its head. 2 of them. In fact, when the workers first retrieve this endo, they think it's meant to be a guitarist and liken those antennae to rabbit ears. They thought this was going to be a Bonnie. In fact, with the adjective used being burnt, I can confidently say that at least this book version of the character was absolutely going to be built up into Burntrap, another burnt endoskeleton with prominent rabbit ears who is presumably trapped down in the pizza place. So, what happened? Well, I do have a theory that would be the connecting fiber between the book Mimic and the Mimic in Ruin, but you'll have to bear with me while I explain. Okay, so at the end of the Tales books, the Mimic is trapped inside a spring-locked jester costume and deactivated. However, this is not the only piece of the Mimic that's out there, as Mimic 1, who we know was in the Pizzaplex's systems at the time, started to mount a rescue mission. The objective? Well, I think it was to restore the Mimic. Vanny removes the Mimic from the Springlock costume and reactivates it. It's here that it decides to put on the Spring Bonnie costume, as recreations of the older characters were prominent at the Pizzaplex at this time. After all, the Mimic may have just been Springlocked, which may have on some level convinced it to start physically mimicking Afton, Springtrap, or Scraptrap. The Mimic, now matching Afton as it had seen him in the Pizza Place fire, is then placed into a charging pod to regain its strength, which is where Gregory finds it during Security Breach. However, the Burntrap ending is not the canon ending, so what happens next? Well, at some point the blob awakens and causes a massive earthquake that reduces the Pizzaplex to rubble. The Mimic, significantly damaged from this earthquake, takes to self-repairing, and removes its old rabbit head, and replaces it with the original head that it had been created with. Since this head does actually match the description of the original head that it was built with in the Mimic's story, not the one that we see in the epilogues. In doing so, one of the few pieces of the body that stayed the same was its left arm, which does match Burntrap's. But now there was a new problem. The Mimic never really had an opportunity to leave. It had been sealed in with concrete previously, and although there was a rickety elevator, he was busy recharging when that was operational. Now that he's back to himself, the Mimic now finds out that the exit is once again sealed by a security system, which had been triggered by the earthquake. That's why he needs a new Vanny. That's why he needs Cassie. And there you have it. That theory covers the in-between chunk of time between the end of the Pizzaplex books and Ruin, and even connects Burntrap. Although really, the whole Burntrap thing could honestly be completely left out, and I think this theory would still work. If there's one big thing that goes unexplained, it would be the Mimic's true motive for why it would try and look like William Afton, and then why it would just stop doing that. I mean, if it decided to mimic him as Glitchtrap, and this carries over to Burntrap, why was the Mimic not doing it in the books or in Ruin? The pieces are there, and I do fully believe that the two are still connected. They are one and the same. But now the question is, how? What I hobbled together here might explain the gap between the books and the games, but there's still something missing. But anyway, do you now understand what I mean when I say the Mimic makes no sense? What happened to that line of Mimic endos? What's with the design changes? What the hell is Burntrap, and why is he so obviously the Mimic, but not the Mimic? The storyline makes no sense, but that's part of why it's so fun to talk about and theorize on. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.